We're going to go into our first session, and it's an honor and a privilege to have Susan Myatt with us. Susan is the first deaf Baptist minister in England. She's got such a wealth of knowledge, and she leads the Open Hands Signing Church, which is a location of the Rising Brook Church in Stafford. I know many of you may know Susan, but for some of you, you may be meeting her for the first time. But I have no doubt that you're going to find what she has to share with us really inspiring. Susan is also the HEBA's national advisor to churches within the Baptist Union. And you can find out more information about Susan in your information booklets. But I'm going to hand over to her now to lead us in our very first session. Thank you so much, Susan.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Can you see me all right? Thank you for your patience. Thank you. So, thank you. And thank you, everybody. And I'd like to thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to worship together and spend time together. And this theme of belonging is wonderful. So today, I'd like to start with explaining a bit about myself as a child. I'm deaf. I was born deaf. My mother and father, on my father's side, there was deafness genetically. On my mother's side, there was hearing, and I wasn't diagnosed until I was about 4. And at that time, you weren't allowed to sign. And so it meant that I couldn't communicate. I had no idea about speech at that time. It's different to now, but at that time, it was a very, very quiet world. I didn't know how to communicate. I couldn't speak. And my first sound that I actually heard, I was about 4, possibly. I was on a road and there was a digger, you know, one of those pneumatic drills. And it terrified me. And it was in my head and it just kept repeating again and again. And I was so frightened. And I couldn't explain or communicate about my fear. I could just see it and I was just frightened. And that was my first sound. And I didn't understand what was going on. When I was about 8, I went to boarding school. And there was everyone who was a bit like me. And at that time, I could make friends. We were oral, yes. We weren't allowed to sign, but we were together. When I was 12, I was at boarding school at a Church of England school, and there was a minister there who used to visit. And that's where I found God for the first time. I didn't fully understand what was going on. I understood there was something there. I felt a connection with God. And I was confirmed at the age of 12. Again, time moved on and I left school and I was looking for a church. There was no deaf church at that time, and I'd visit hearing churches and it was just awful. It was very, very difficult experience. I didn't feel I belonged. I didn't feel any connection or relationship, and it was a real struggle. I felt like they were pitying me and they wanted to pray for me to become hearing so I could hear again. I didn't want that. And so there's lots of stories like that. And I believe God accepts me as I am. That's me. So I just stopped going to church, but I knew God. Although it was difficult and a lot went over my head and there was a lot of hurt and rejection and experiences like that, I continued with him. Now I realize that God didn't pity me and I've changed. I realized I was called to empower deaf people, and that they can have a relationship with God. They can worship God in their own culture and identity, and they can do this. So I'm so thankful that in the Old Testament, there's a quote in Leviticus, chapter 8, verse 14. Bear with me, I can't find that reference. At that time, it was said, this quote was, "Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of them, but fear the Lord your God." At that time, of course, deaf and blind people were the poorest in any community because they couldn't earn a living. But this verse in Leviticus, I feel that there's compassion there that was encouraged at that time. And that was so long ago. So there were deaf and blind people there at that time, and that was just wonderful. We know this famous story in John chapter 4, verses 4 to 15. There's a Samaritan woman. And in Jewish culture, we know that when Jesus met her and spoke to her at the well, that would have been a shocking thing to talk with this woman. Jesus himself was breaking cultural norms and laws. He would have grown up knowing about this. And this Samaritan woman would have known that as well, that it wasn't appropriate. It would have been normal for her to have no connection with deaf people, with Jewish people. And of course, she felt marginalized as well. And possibly that's how deaf people felt in history over time. Deaf people just accepted that fact that they were marginalized on the edge. So just to explain a bit more about the background and some history as well, linked to our theme of belonging. And I need to be clear that at the start, there are three groups of deaf people. And there are three different cultures: is hearing people, hard of hearing, and deaf and big D deaf people. So there's three different cultures, and I'm going to focus on this third one because there isn't time to cover the other two cultures, hearing and hard of hearing. So I'm going to talk about big D deaf. That means they use sign language. That's the one I'm going to focus on today. So let's start thinking about the views and the emphasis given to spoken language and how it affected deaf people historically. By the Middle Ages, medieval times, the view on deafness was that from the Bible, it says that God created Adam and blew his spirit into him. And that breath is linked to directly to speech, and therefore spoken language is the really only divine way to communicate with God. So in medieval times, deafness was considered an appalling calamity. This is a hearing man called Aman, and he was a deaf educator. in the 17th century. And he is quoted as saying, "The voice is a living emanation of that spirit that God breathed into man when he created him a living soul." And so, because deaf people who use sign language can't speak, they don't use their voices, he said, what stupidity we find in these unfortunate deaf, how little they differ from animals. And that's a quote. Before 1880, there had been about 200 deaf schools worldwide using the manual method, teaching and learning using sign language, with many deaf teachers, professionals, and other tradespeople being quite successfully educated using this method. So they use sign language in education. This is a slide showing a conference in Milan in 1880. It was a big conference, but they were all hearing people working with deaf people, maybe teaching or whatever. Deaf people weren't allowed into the conference. Most were from Italy and France, and many were from the churches of the day. And they were arguing about whether to use oral methods or signing methods in education. And they all agreed that it should be an oral method adopted. We've no evidence of why they decided to do this, but when children are born deaf or they're deafened, they miss out. They've got no spoken language. If you're born hearing and you become deaf, you've had memory of spoken language, but we've no evidence of what they were discussing and the detail of that at the conference. But there's another quote that says, "Oral speech is the sole power that can rekindle the light of God breathed into man when giving him a soul in a corporal body. He gave him also a means of understanding and conceiving and of expressing himself. But on the other hand, mimic signs are not enough to express the fullness of thought, or you could say they enhance and glorify fantasy and all the faculties of the sense of imagination." And that was a statement from the conference in Italy, from an Italian priest at the time. So there was a lot of different oppression of deaf people. And at that time, the priority was to agree this, the proposal was to agree this, and that sign language would be banned. So it would be banned from education, social and political domains, and they just weren't allowed to sign. So that was a massive change, and that happened in 1880. So education of deaf children just deteriorated from then on. They were all educated orally, this being because it was felt that they must speak in order to go to heaven. And still today, as a result, many deaf children, even today, their reading age remains quite low. So say at 16, they've got a reading age of about 8 to 12. So they are quite a bit behind because the reading relies on sounds that hearing people teach. And obviously that's not suitable for teaching deaf children. They can't hear. So how can they speak? And how can they learn? It's so difficult. There's a deaf priest called Hannah Lewis. She's a Church of England minister based in Liverpool. And she was the first deaf priest to do a PhD in theology. Possibly she's the first in the world to do a PhD in the subject. And in her research, she found various things. It's saying that deaf and uneducated people were likened to savages or even animals in their behavior. So they're comparing us to animals. It's simply because we cannot communicate and we're frustrated and we get angry and we just feel subordinated because of language. So over time, this sort of attitude and continued in school. Teaching was still oral for many, many, many years. And later in 1945, there was the BDDA, the British Deaf and Dumb Association. And they said deaf people were like animals. And in the worst of all situations, they have no communication to lift themselves above the status of beasts. And I just want to say, in addition, that the word dumb is not acceptable. It's not used today. So we have dropped that term because it's so oppressive. Some people, unfortunately, still do use it, but we don't use that label or that word. That has been dropped. So it's interesting that comparing deaf people over the years to animals, that's just so discriminatory. There's so much oppression. And at school myself, which was an oral school, it wasn't easy. But at the end, there was no expectation that you would do anything professionally in terms of a career. You would be working in a factory or cleaning or working as a cook or something, but you were told so many times the things you couldn't do. And it was just became something that you accepted as you grew up. And really, as I look back, it was awful. It wasn't right. Lots of deaf people have many, many different skills and huge imaginations that have been bottled up over the years. So it's only really recently, very recently, in March 2003, March the 18th, that finally there was recognition by the government of BSL. So that's relatively recently, isn't it? It's barely 18 years ago that it was finally recognised as a language. So finally, legally, we can sign. But the problem is there are still issues there. It's not fully recognised, not yet. For example, in Scotland, They achieved recognition in 2015. So how would you know the difference in England and Wales? You know that because when you see any broadcasts in Scotland of Nicola Sturgeon speaking, you will see next to her an interpreter. And throughout coronavirus announcements from her, there was an interpreter, but it hasn't been the case in England. There wasn't an interpreter next to the speaker in England through all those announcements. And there was a campaign. We need more interpreters for news and events and the current issues. But England and Wales haven't had that same recognition as Scotland. So well done, Scotland. So there wasn't that official recognition in Westminster. So some examples of myself, of discrimination that I've experienced and seen. Pastorally, I have to visit care homes, and I visited a deaf lady who'd been there for 2 years. She was in there before lockdown, but nobody could sign or communicate with her. The staff couldn't communicate with her, and obviously you couldn't visit throughout lockdown. And so she was incredibly isolated. And the first time I visited her, she just poured out her heart. I just want a newspaper. And she wasn't given anything because she couldn't communicate. Nobody understood sign language. She's stuck in one room in her 4 walls by herself. And when the doctor came and spoke, or the staff came, they would just shout at her, and she couldn't hear, and she was so distressed. And she was in that situation for 2 years. Nobody could sign. She couldn't have any of her deaf friends visit her or anything like that. And that was very, very moving. That really impacted me. The staff aren't really aware. I'm not criticizing them, but they just weren't aware of her needs. If you go to visit someone in hospital, I know a story about someone who was absolutely in bits because a chaplain had come to visit and she couldn't understand. And they went to the next bed and that patient was hearing, and she could see they could have a wonderful conversation, and they had communion. And she was so distressed. I've been a Christian for 30 years. And I haven't been able to communicate. And I feel I'd love prayer. I'd love to share. I'd love communion. And I'm stuck in hospital for 6 weeks. And I just feel such a rejection from God because the chaplain couldn't communicate with me. And the next day they would come and they would just, or the next visit, they would come and just bypass her bed and just give her the briefest of nods. And that was so hurtful. So there's many things like that. And it's all to do with education. People don't understand sign language and how to support people who use sign language. And here, of course, is Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon with the interpreter next to her. And this is a slide from the campaign about where is the interpreter, which we needed for the news and any emergencies or crises or something. There was no access throughout coronavirus. How would we as a deaf community know what was going on? I've experienced myself waiting for a hospital appointment for physiotherapy. The consultant said, yes, I do need physiotherapy. And I thought, that's fine. And I waited and I waited and I waited. 6 months later, nothing had happened. So I emailed the consultant and I said, I've been waiting and nothing's happened. And they were so shocked. You should have heard ages ago. And so they contacted the physiotherapy department and they found out that the team there in the department, couldn't use email. They didn't send letters or a text. They only used phone calls. And they tried to ring me 4 times. And on the 4th time, because I didn't answer, my name was taken off the waiting list. And so how many people feel like that in the deaf community? There must be so many people with all these barriers. You can't access things. And it's so distressing considering we are in the 21st century. So, thinking about the barriers that deaf people have to cope with in church today. You know, in the New Testament, there are references to speaking and hearing. And that's really challenging for deaf Christians. And here's one example of a Bible verse for you to read. And another. Here's another. This Bible reading, if you would like to read that, please. And you know it's about a deaf man in Mark chapter 7, 31 to 37. It's interesting in this Bible reading. It's, if you think about hearing people's perspective compared to a deaf person's perspective in terms of language. This famous story, the healing of a deaf man. A lot of people, deaf people, feel, I know some deaf people do want to be healed, and they possibly were born hearing, then as they grew up, something happened and they became deaf, and I can understand they want to be healed. But for people who were born deaf, it's normal for us. So why would we want to be healed? And this story, we don't know if this man was born deaf or if he was born hearing and he became deaf later on. We don't know that. But a lot of deaf people feel this is such a sensitive story and it's difficult. Even for me as a speaker, and this Greek word, ephatha, which means be opened. Some commentators have said that this means being opened in the mind and the heart. Not that they would hear, but their heart and mind would be open. And that's the miracle, because this man was marginalized. But the miracle is that through his heart and mind being opened, he would no longer be marginalized. He would feel he could belong. And many Christians assume that deaf people want to be healed. They automatically put their hands over a deaf person's ears. I've had this experience many times when I've gone forward for prayer, and I thought, yeah, people have said, I'd like to pray for you. And I'd say, yes, thank you. And immediately they put their hands on my ears to pray for me to become hearing. And that's quite painful, because I never asked for that prayer. I didn't ask to be healed. Inside, I cringe, but I have a mask on outside, but inside, I just feel really hurt. So prayer can be a difficult thing. I don't want to be changed. I'm accepted as I am, and I want people to accept me and not make assumptions. I'm created in God's image, and many deaf people feel the same. It's just normal for me to be deaf. I don't know how I'd cope to become hearing. I can't imagine it. This is my identity. This is who I am. It's the same as many deaf people would feel they don't want to change. They could probably want prayer for emotional healing, for the hurts and things, but not to be healed of their deafness and become hearing. So inside, a lot of deaf people would feel they don't have the confidence because I've got to become like a hearing person. In Mark, in this story, it just gives hope that we can belong when our minds and our hearts are open. And it doesn't matter who we are. With God, we can belong and have fellowship together. I've got exciting news. There's a Bible BSL translation project, because deaf people have had huge issues accessing an English Bible, because it's dependent on the spoken word, and deaf people use a visual language. So this was set up, I think, about 13 years ago, this project. And it was set up to create a BSL Bible. And they've been working with scholars, and it takes a long, long time to make sure it's an accurate translation. So it's an example of accessible text. And in the future, the hope is that we can all access the same text, whether we're deaf or hearing, with our own versions. So have a look at this. There's a lot of work involved in creating this translation in BSL. we have to wait for funding. We have focus groups. We've got to film things. There's a lot involved in this project. But at the same time, it's so exciting because it makes the Bible accessible for us in our own language. And we don't have to rely on words that are difficult for us to read and understand. So lots of deaf people ask me when I'm visiting them, say perhaps pastorally, when I die and I go to heaven, will I become hearing? And they're worried because they don't want to become hearing when they go to heaven. They want to keep this same identity in heaven. And there seems to be this unspoken expectation that they will be hearing and like everyone else. We don't know, but the important thing is that we know Jesus. I do reassure them that they can have a relationship with God, and that's the priority. For myself, it does make me smile because I have so many questions. For example, what's it like to be deaf? It's difficult for me to respond to. So now I try to be nice and sort of say, what's it like to be hearing? So we can have that sort of conversation. Another question is, can deaf people drive? I mean, why would they assume that deaf people cannot drive? Can deaf people speak and preach? I don't know why they would ask that. So we get lots and lots of questions like this. And this is now even so in the 21st century still. It persists. Finally. I love this. I've added some texts to this reading from Galatians chapter 3, verse 28 that you can read. So talking about language, many people don't realize that lip reading, you only get about 30% of the information. We have to rely on body language, and so it's very, very difficult for us. Lip reading is difficult to process mentally, and so for myself, I feel I can make mistakes because there are some words that look very, very similar on the lips, and that can be embarrassing, and you can lose confidence, and you've got to have your eyes fixed on what's going on all the time. So I live in a hearing world for 95% of the time, and my eyes are forever scanning and watching people carefully. And I could say that my eyes have become my ears. I'm watching for people's body language. I'm looking at their lip pattern, and I'm trying to work out, I'm trying to mentally process what is being communicated. And it's difficult. It's not easy. So this word that many people ask me about, deaf and hearing churches, should they be merged or should they be separate? And it's a good question. Inclusive church is a good question. From my experience, it's better to be separate. It empowers deaf people that they feel they can do things, they can have a relationship with God, they can grow spiritually, because they're using their own language, their identity. They've got a deaf space where they can visualize things and create wonderful things. And it's just amazing. But if you go to a hearing church, it's not the same. It's different. They feel disempowered and subordinate. So a separate space where they can relate to God is better. But we do need to be connected with each other, don't we? And it's almost like bridge building between the hearing church and the deaf church. So this inclusive church, I'm not sure what it means. I mean, you may have interpreters in a hearing church, and that's brilliant, but are we really included? It's still English, and it's still hearing perspective and culture and worship, which is so different to deaf culture and worship. And how you put those two together, an inclusive church, as for example, if I'm invited to go to a church, that's fine, but it's quite tricky. I've got to think of their culture. It's a hearing culture, and I've got to think about their way and their normal way of doing things, and I've got to adjust to match their way. And they don't necessarily adjust to how I would do things. And so it is quite a big question, this, isn't it? I'm just checking the time here. So deaf people express worship and Bible readings in their language. But the problem is that historically, it's almost like we've been spoon-fed over the years, for many, many years. And lots of people have no confidence to do things for themselves. And I try to empower people and say, yeah, you can do things. You can have a relationship with God. I can remember one man who'd been a Christian for 30 years or more. And I asked him to pray, and he said, yes, yeah, I'll pray. Yeah, yeah. I said, right. And he seemed to be waiting. And he said, would you write out the prayer for me? Because for years and years, someone had written a prayer out for him, and he would sign this prayer from a written word on the paper. And he'd never actually spontaneously prayed in his own language, and he was a bit panicky. And I said, what would you like to pray for? And he chatted through what he was thinking about. And I said, well, that's prayer. And he was amazed. He just didn't know. So we need to find different ways of encouraging deaf worship in their culture, in their visual way. We need to teach them the old-fashioned way, like before 1880. We don't know what the church was like at that time before that conference in Milan, but my passion, my absolute passion, is that deaf people would have a relationship with God, and they can work together with hearing people as well. And they can feel they belong in church, and that's so important. That's vital. They can belong. They are welcomed. Many don't know how to communicate with deaf people, and they don't feel it's a proper conversation. And so deaf people can feel a little bit rejected because they don't have a proper conversation because of communication. We've got a long way to go. I mean, people are making steps like learning basic sign language, like hello, how are you, and God bless you. And that's wonderful. People can feel a connection and feel that we are together, one body in his kingdom. I could go on, but I better stop because of time. Let me just check my notes. A final thing that I'd like to say. one person asked, do you feel treated equally? And my response would be, yes and no. People who know me well, I feel they do treat me equally. But if someone's met me for the first time, I feel they're treating me differently. And once they know I'm deaf, they might walk away, or they might speak slowly in a very exaggerated fashion. And it's just, I understand they're embarrassed, but I want to be treated equally. All deaf people just want to be treated the same way. I don't want to sound critical, but it's just so important to realise that it's communication, it's language, isn't it? So many churches have so many different situations and setups, don't they? It's just to let you know, and just to be aware that there are differences in deafness. You might sort of say to a church, oh, you know, I'd like to come. And they say, oh, yeah, we've got a deaf person, we've got an interpreter. And there's an elderly lady who's actually deafened and she lip reads. And so that's quite difficult. A lot of churches don't understand the difference between big D deaf and little d deaf. Little d deaf is hard of hearing. And so there's differences in these groups of hearing loss. They have to be looked at separately, really. Deafened or hard of hearing people feel they don't belong in a deaf church because I was born hearing, and they struggle in a hearing church because they rely on lip reading and it's so hard. And so we need to find a new way forward, really, don't we? How we can all be together as one body, the church, united, belonging together, but through God's grace that he pours out and his Holy Spirit upon us, we will find a way through to be united. I think that's probably enough for now. I think I'm handing back to Leonie now, aren't I?
Yes, you can do, Susan.
So hopefully we can learn from this session and make it a priority in our churches as we gather. So thank you very much for your time and for listening. And I'm sorry to go on at such length, but I would like to say one thing. I want to apologise. I missed out a fourth category, deaf-blind people. When I was speaking earlier, I should have added those to the hearing, deaf and deaf-blind, but thank you.